Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you're in for a double trouble treat today as I have Tim O'Toole and Matt Ellis, both from Miller and Chevalier. And we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is what the heck's going on at the border and related issues. So, gentlemen, first of all, thank you and for taking the time to visit with me today on this most prescient topic.
Thank you, Tom, for this opportunity.
So,
Yeah,
Tim,
Tom, go ahead.
could you just tell us what your role is at Miller?
Yeah, so Tom, I run the export controls and sanctions and national security practice at Miller Chevalier. We do a lot of export controls and sanctions, but we also touch on some national security topics that I think we're going to talk about today.
And Matt, remind the audience what you're doing these days.
Yes, I head up the Latin America team at Miller and Chevalier, and given the Trump administration's focus on the region, we've been quite busy.
You guys penned an article on the designation of cartels as FTOs and what the risk this heightens for companies operating in Mexico and greater Latin America. And I wanted to use that as a jumping off point to explore this topic and really highlight the risks and maybe put together some risk management strategies, tools, or techniques our listeners could begin to think about. So, could we start with the EO?
Yes, I'll jump in. One of President Trump's first moves when he became president in his second administration was issuing an executive order, which, as you say, Tom, designated cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And since January 20th, we've engaging in a lot of talk on what this means for companies. And just to get to the chase, it severely heightens consequences, risks, restrictions for companies operating in places like Mexico, and we're excited to explore those with you. At the end of the day, the messaging is if you're a company operating in Mexico, if you're a company from Mexico, it really would behoove you to reconsider your risk assessments and consider what types of controls you might want to enhance.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add that from the sanction side, we've been dealing with similar risks in Mexico for years, in the sense that many of these groups that are now on the foreign terrorist organizations list, the FTO list that Matt was talking about, were previously designated under OFAC sanctions. So they were SDNs, specially designated nationals. So companies couldn't deal with them. But when President Trump issued the executive order, the consequences of dealing with these groups heightened. And so what we've been doing is trying to figure out what are the new risks that companies faced in addition to the risks that they already faced under the sanctions regime. And we've come up with some strategies for that, but that's really the fundamental issue that we've been looking at.
Tim, if I could follow up on that just a bit to ask, I think many of our listeners are certainly going to be familiar with SDNs, but taking a company to an FTO designation or an entity or a person is a whole different level. Could you really explain the difference in what that means to U.S. companies and compliance officers?
Yeah, and there is one roadmap for this because in 2020, President Trump made the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, the IRGC, into a foreign terrorist organization. They'd been an SDN for a long time, and he changed them into an FTO, and President Biden left that in place. And so, with respect to Iran, what we saw was an increase in the ease of seizures and forfeitures. So, particularly with respect to Iranian oil, so seizures of items that are linked to the FTO and oil in Iran was one of them, was something where we saw a big risk. And so that's one additional risk is it just makes it easier to seize items that are traced to the cartel, and they can be traced in ways that are multiple levels of supply chain beyond the cartel. So essentially, you don't have to get that close to the IRGC if you just have Iranian oil. And to apply that to Mexico, it means that if you're at all dealing with the cartels in any way, it's possible to then trace that from the US government much easier than it would be with an SDN to take things, to seize things, to forfeit things. So from a civil standpoint, that's there. But then you also face civil liability under the Anti-Terrorism Act. It's 18 USC 2333. So additional risks of civil liability, and then a heightened risk of criminal liability under the material support for terrorism or material support for FTO laws, which is 18 USC 2339B. And so those are kind of the new heightened risks that are faced because of the FTO designation.
Just to build upon that, and the reason this is so complex in Mexico is the cartels have such a broad, wide, and deep presence throughout the Mexican economy now. We're not in a place where it's just a group of uneducated people living in the mountains of Sinaloa. No, these are highly sophisticated groups. These are groups that have penetrated all different sorts of economies throughout the country, whether you're talking about agriculture or tourism or diesel gas. Even the toniest neighborhoods of Mexico City have significant cartel presence. I was just in Mexico City this week and hearing stories of restaurants on Avenida Mazeric, one of the most sophisticated avenues in the city, being owned by cartels, being frequented by cartel leadership. A cartel accountant just a few weeks ago was murdered right in Polanco. And so the concept of now companies being liable for providing material support, for aiding and abetting FTOs, cartels, in a country like Mexico, where cartels are around every corner, is really something that's striking, and the risks really couldn't be higher from our perspective.
Matt, maquiladora plants have faced these challenges literally since NAFTA in the 90s. And I just feel like this is a risk that is going to, I don't want to say balloon, but skyrocket for those types of businesses. How can companies begin to think through a response now? Does it start with assess your risk, or are we way beyond that?
Risk assessment is what everyone is talking about on the ground, people who are taking this risk seriously. And frankly, Tom, we're really in a period of education, right? Educating companies on what this means. But yes, risk assessment. I'll give you two examples of the types of risk that the maquiladora might face in northern Mexico. First, the derecho de piso, right? The payment to simply be there and operate, the monthly security payments, let's call them. And it's not just someone coming by the gate with a gun asking for the envelope of cash. No, that's not how these payments play out anymore. The cartels are highly sophisticated. They set up front companies. Those front companies are engaged by the corporation. Perhaps the front company looks legitimate. Perhaps it's providing some form of goods to the company. Perhaps it's simulating services. So it's sophisticated ways of hiding these operation payments. You have these factory mills, these invoicing mills that produce fake invoices, which help hide the true nature of the relationship. So that's a first major category of risk. A second category is the derecho de paso, any company that has exposure to transportation, distribution, logistics, needing to make those payments to pass on a certain rural highway. That's another key risk. And so understanding those pockets of risk really is the starting point. From there, companies would be positioned to leverage their current controls, to enhance, modify those controls to get at those risks.
Yeah, I just spent the last 2 days with clients trying to walk through some of these risks. And clients who operate in Mexico are really needing to figure out what are we doing, where are we doing it, and how are we getting our goods through if we're passing them through Mexico, if we're transporting them to Mexico, if we're operating in Mexico in any way, where might we come into contact with the cartels? And I think what this order has done is cause companies to really start thinking through this, because until you understand kind of what you're doing in Mexico with a fine tooth comb, because these sorts of rites of passage that Matt is talking about, those things are things that are probably routine enough in Mexican life, but small enough and often without a US nexus that from a sanction standpoint, you'd obviously prefer that you not do them, but you may not have the resources to figure out exactly what you're doing. But what the FTO designation does is it says, okay, even without a US nexus, there are real risks at this point, and you better figure out what you're doing in Mexico and spend some resources doing that. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, that's what companies are doing right now.
Tim, let me use that to go to the next point I wanted to explore with you, which is this designation applies equally to non-US domiciled companies. And can you explain the risks they might have, whether there's that US nexus, jurisdictional nexus or not?
Yeah, so one of the things that the FTO designation does is it lowers the jurisdictional nexus that the U.S. would need to bring a criminal or a civil case against a non-U.S. company that engages in what the criminal statutes would call material support for terrorism. And there's actually some law at this point that suggests that there's enough of a nexus to the U.S. if the sector that you're dealing with is one that's controlled by the cartel. For example, avocados are in interstate commerce. There's reports that the cartels are very infiltrated into the avocado industry. There's some law that suggests that if you're dealing in the avocado industry in Mexico, that's enough of a nexus to the US because it affects US commerce in avocados, for example, that a non-US company that is in the avocado market in Mexico automatically has a US nexus and can be subject to civil, criminal, and potentially forfeiture liability in the US because of its participation in an industry that affects US commerce.
Gentlemen, we have focused on Mexico in this first segment. I wanted to explore Latin America. And Matt and I had some really fulsome and interesting discussions on this back in January, and then you guys came out with your paper. So I was really intrigued by how you see this playing out in Latin America and some of the potential collateral consequences down the road that Conspiracy Tom has rolled up in his head. But before we get there, Matt, how do we get to Latin America, and what does all this mean for both U.S. companies doing business in Latin America, but equally important, Latin American companies selling into the U.S. or who may have a U.S. subsidiary?
From before January 20th, before Trump took office again, we have been speculating that Latin America will be front and center to this administration, right? The administration cares about fentanyl, the drug trade. It cares about migration flows, illegal immigration. It cares about jobs and jobs being exported to the region, right? And that certainly has occurred. Many of the major moves of this administration have been Latin America focused. Adding FTO designation for the cartels to the mix. One of the 8 cartels that was designated is a cartel by the name of Tren de Agua. It's a cartel out of Venezuela that now has presence throughout Central America, Mexico, and South America. So wide ranging, which again gives this administration very significant powers to enforce US law now throughout the region. There are many who are speculating that Donald Trump very well might use these powers in a weaponized way. Just in Mexico this week, someone mentioned, could he go after the son of Lopez Obrador, the former president of Mexico? The son is a man who has business interests throughout the country, has strong political, they say he might run for president. If Mexico doesn't cooperate, this is a tool that Trump could use. And so weaponization could certainly be in the picture. And another element, Pam Bondi, the new attorney general, on her second day, the day after she was confirmed, issued a memorandum focused on this issue, cartels in Latin America. And one thing she did in that memorandum was create a new policy directive within DOJ saying that U.S. attorneys throughout the country no longer needed to come to Main Justice for the same form of approvals that were required in the past. This could have the effect of unleashing U.S. attorneys who want to make a name for themselves, want to get those big cases, to utilize these new laws to go after cartels in the region. So we could see a patchwork of various enforcement. What this means at the end of the day for companies operating in the region is, a whole new set of risks and a whole new set of potential consequences for their conduct in Mexico. And that, again, puts a premium on considering compliance infrastructure right now to get ahead of these trends. Tim, what am I missing?
Nothing, you're not missing anything, but I think to just kind of make it kind of concrete. So essentially, now the U.S. attorney's offices under the Bondi memo have the ability to bring a charge of support for a foreign terrorist organization, material support for a foreign terrorist organization. It's a criminal charge under 18 USC 2339. They can bring these cases just by showing that you knowingly provided support to a material terrorist organization, the rite of passage. The derecho de paso that you talked about before, if you pay that now and you know that you're paying it to a cartel that is a FTO, you've arguably committed a federal crime. And it's much easier at this point to charge and prove that crime now that there's an FTO because the jurisdictional nexus standard is very low under 18 USC to 2339B, and the mens rea, the intent standards, is very low. And so it's easy to bring a criminal case. It's much easier to bring a forfeiture case, and we're going to see these cases according to the Bondi Amendment. It's going to be the high priority of this administration. And so operating in sectors where the cartels operate is going to be much, much tougher at this point. And Mexico is a big one. But as the map that you guys did about a week ago pointed out, it's all over Latin America. It's, if I were a company, I'd start in Mexico because it just, if you look at the map that we did, the cartels are all over Mexico and in isolated places in some of the other countries. And most U.S. companies don't have exposure to Venezuela, which is probably the other country that this affects most. But Mexico is where it's at. But Latin America is now a place that U.S. attorneys will find a considerable number of cases that they could go after.
One more element that we can't forget is, in a way, it doesn't even matter what the Trump administration does here, because what the FTO designation does under the Anti-Terrorism Act
Yeah.
is creates the possibility for civil suits.
Yeah.
Imagine a terrorist event, and this happens all of the time in Mexico, a cartel event in which a U.S. citizen is caught in the crossfire, is injured, is killed. The family of that individual can bring a civil case against a company that has been aiding and abetting the cartel. There's no need to show that the company's support of the cartel was linked directly to the violent event. All that needs to be shown is that material support, that aiding and abetting. And when a aggrieved or an injured plaintiff or his or her family can recover treble damages, can recover attorney fees, and there are plaintiffs' firms. We've defended a number of these cases involving other parts of the world. There are plaintiffs' firms that specialize in FTO, Anti-Terrorism Act, civil suits, and they are already making public statements that they're focused on Mexico. So
Yep.
this is a risk that can continue irrespective of what the Trump administration does or does not do. Tim, please.
Yeah, no, one thing I was going to add to that, Matt, is I've been talking with clients now about the scenario in which a person in the US dies from fentanyl. Could the family then sue a company that paid a rite of passage to the cartels in Mexico under the theory that death was caused by the cartels of a US person and essentially caused in part by the material support for an FTO that was provided by a US company? And it's really hard to see why that sort of suit couldn't be brought. And I would expect that there are a number of plaintiffs' firms right now that are trying to figure out whether they can bring those suits, because if that suit becomes viable under the Anti-Terrorism Act, we're going to see a lot of civil litigation arising from this, and companies are going to need to really give some consideration to what they're going to do to really protect and comply against this.
Tim, I want to go down a rabbit hole you opened a little bit, and that is around actual knowledge, reduced mens rea. And I believe you, maybe it was Matt, but I think you used the term had actual knowledge of or knew. But could I add, comma, should have known? So could we put an affirmative duty on these U.S. companies to show not that they buried their head in the sand, but they had to engage in active risk management strategies, active due diligence, so that almost akin to the failure to prevent fraud in the United Kingdom or some other affirmative duty. So the duty is even broader than knew, you should have known. Is that a direction we could see?
Absolutely. We've been telling clients that's really going to be the standard that you're going to be held to. The statutes say knowingly, but knowledge is a fact issue. And if you want to be in front of a jury arguing that you didn't know when you're a big company and you've got somebody on the other side who is the family of somebody who was killed or injured, good luck to you. And so if you want to have any sort of chance at a defense in these cases, you're going to not only have to show you didn't know, you're going to have to show that there's no way for you to know. And so you're going to have to show things like we did a huge risk assessment to figure out whether our people were dealing with cartels. We had policies in place that you can't deal with the cartels. You can't pay the rights of passage. We had people in place that were trying to make sure that didn't happen. So whatever happened with respect to these cartels was completely outside of company policy. That's the sort of thing that you're going to want to have in place. If you ever get to the point where somebody's arguing that you knew, you want to show not only did we not know, there was no way that we could have known because we were trying to figure out kind of what the facts were on the ground, and we did everything we could do to prevent ourselves from dealing with cartels.
Being in Mexico this week, just to add, and being with the corporate compliance community there on the ground, there's a lot of thought now being put into this question of red flags, right? We're all experts on FCPA corruption red flags. We've written the articles, the master list of corruption red flags. What do red flags look like in the material support to FTO context, right? Is it that the counterparty has a tattoo that shows the logo of the cartel? Is it that they're holding a gun? It could be a member of the FTO, or it could be a member of one of the thousands of splinter groups that is not a designated entity. And so it's raising some really interesting questions about how to manage this risk on the front line, not to mention the security related questions associated with looking into an indication of material support, right? Encouraging frontline employees to raise their hand and bring to the compliance office's attention request for material support. These are all really complex questions for companies that have decided they want to actively manage this area.
So, Matt, one of the areas we considered in some of our visitations was, could there be a step towards companies who knowingly or not are purchasing products that are built with either workers using who are in modern slavery or detained in some way, similar to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act? I'm
Yes.
specifically thinking about Latin American clothing companies who may be importing and may not be have as robust compliance around that as U.S. companies do. Could you see this extension of the Trump administration that they started with the FTO expanding into other areas that are deemed national security interests, such as the fight against modern slavery or human trafficking?
We've already seen out of USTR some indication that for Central America, there is interest in tying concerns on human rights to new trade restrictions. That is a tool that could certainly be applied to the Mexico context, to the fentanyl trade, to immigration. One thing we've just been discussing internally with our business and human rights practice is back to cartels and FTO designation. How do you identify the risk from an anti-corruption perspective? It's difficult because that approach is, again, looking for red flags or touch points with government officials. That might get you close to the cartel issue, especially if certain municipal officials are backed by a cartel, but it doesn't get you all the way. From the economic sanctions perspective, you're looking at vetting counterparties, getting at beneficial ownership. That will get you part of the way. A tool that we think can be very effective in managing cartel related risk is bringing to bear best practices in the business and human rights context, human rights due diligence. What this does, and many companies might not realize it, but they've already committed through their public statements, through their embracing of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, they've already committed to human rights focused due diligence. This type of due diligence means that companies are engaging local communities. They're engaging local stakeholders to understand from those sources how those sources see risk. Imagine employing that in the cartel context. That might be a way for a company to get at risk of movement of people, risk of cartel infiltration of local communities, right? Get at information that then is fed back to the company itself to help it retool its operations to manage the cartel related risk. So you are very correct to tie these issues to business and human rights. It's relevant on the supply chain side, it's relevant on the human rights due diligence side, and it's things that people are actively considering now. For me, it's really a next chapter in corporate compliance. That's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, Tom, and to go back to part of your question, I really do think this rebuttable presumption from the business and human rights context from the UFLPA is likely to come up in connection with the cartels, because there are certain industries that the cartels have allegedly infiltrated. You could see using this rebuttable presumption that those items are linked to the cartels, and if you want to import them into the United States, you've got to rebut the presumption that they're linked to the cartels. It seems like a very workable model for the cartel context, and I'd be surprised if the administration isn't thinking about using it already.
Gentlemen, we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to end with almost a current event that came down this week. And this comes to us a report from the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. has ordered money transmitters along the Mexican border to start filing reports on cash transactions greater than $200. This is designed to fight small monies that cartels launder on the Mexican border. The $200 limit obviously is quite low. And I really wanted to use that as either a springboard to ask, will we see more of these types of efforts? Or is this a level of the fight against cartels that shows how far the Trump administration is willing to go?
Yeah, I think that's just it. How far the administration is willing to go, how creative the administration is willing to be to get at these issues. The Department of Treasury's FinCEN order directing these money transaction businesses on 30 zip codes throughout the Mexico-U.S. border reports at the $200 level really seem zealous or overzealous. What is the US government really going to do with all of that data? It was striking that the threshold is so low, will create quite a headache for companies participating in currency transaction services. And I think it is a signal, right? It's a signal on what's to come.
Yeah, I also think it's kind of, we'll see if the $200 threshold sticks, because the reports are that these money services businesses, that's how you get paid. So if you send a bunch of fentanyl across the border as a cartel in Mexico to somebody in the US, they're not going to go to Citibank and send you a wire back, with the memo being for 8 million tons of fentanyl, right? You're going to use a money services business. There's some reports that the money services business would be essentially send money to China, and there'd be repayment in goods that come into China from Mexico. So essentially, the 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 purchaser of the fentanyl buys a bunch of stuff in China that is then sent to the cartels in Mexico. And so it's a very complicated payment scheme. And so I think one of the things that this order is trying to do is have FinCEN figure out, okay, so what are the money services businesses doing? What are some of the transactions that we can look at now and get visibility into and figure out what's happening? So they're looking at everything over $200. Once they figure it out, maybe they'll raise the threshold, because I think the burden is going to be huge. But I think right now they're trying to get visibility into these transactions and figure out where they need to focus.
Gentlemen, that seems like a great place for us to end as we are near the end of our time for this episode. I'm going to link to both the firm profile, your individual firm profiles, and the great article that led to the start of the discussions to have this podcast. I'm going to request that we continue this conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tom. This is great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. I'm a longtime listener and fan of your podcast, so it's nice to be on it.